I come before you tonight with great pleasure. It's an honor to come back to Emory. I seem to come back, drawn back, as you would to any great university, periodically. And I'm very pleased to be able to participate in the Darwin event, of which we will be seeing a great many more around the world in the coming year. There is on the screen here the iconic image of Charles Darwin. It was taken in 1874 when he was 65 years old. He was born on February 12th, 1809. And some of you will immediately recognize that that is the same year, month, and day as Abraham Lincoln. In 1869, 10 years after the publication of The Origin of Species, Charles Darwin wrote his close friend, the great botanist Joseph Hooker, as follows. "If I lived 20 more years," he said, "and was able to work, how I should have to modify the origin, and how much the views on all points will have to be modified." Well, it is a beginning, and that is something. Darwin lived 13 more years after writing that letter to Hooker, and he did manage to modify the theory of evolution by natural selection by expanding it in The Descent of Man in 1871 to include human origins, and the expression of the emotions in man and animals in 1872 to address the evolution of instinct. And thus was complete what can be called the four great books of Darwin, although he authored many other influential articles and books during his career. Here they are, and for short, you can call them Voyage, Origin, Descent, and Emotions. A great question for final biology exams. Here is Darwin at the height of his creative powers at about the age of 50, and at the time of the writing of The Origin of Species. So I would, in passing, like to suggest the following rule about the age of peak originality and productivity in different kinds of thinkers. This is a bit of a stretch, but I hope you will accept it in the spirit I give it. Mathematicians peak in their late teens, physicists in their late 20s, molecular biologists in their late 30s, and philosophers never. I hope that sort of observation, will be useful to the high command of Emory. Here is the master naturalist not long after his 5-year voyage on the Beagle, when he learned so much of the real world and his mind was churning with new information and ideas. This surely he was approaching his creative peak here. Here is the masterpiece itself, the frontispiece of the first edition, I think. That's the first edition, 1859. The 130 years ensuing after the completion of the four great books has seen an enormous growth of the Darwinian heritage, joined with molecular and cellular biology. That accumulated knowledge is today a large part of the substance of modern biology. Its centrality justifies the famous remark made by the evolutionary geneticist Theodosius Dobzhansky, the foremost of the modern synthesizers of the 20th century. He famously said in 1973, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." In fact, nothing in science as a whole has been more firmly established by interwoven factual information or more illuminating than the universal occurrence of biological evolution. Further, few natural processes have been more convincingly explained than evolution by the theory of natural selection, or as it has been popularly called, Darwinism, Great scientific discoveries are like sunrises. They illuminate first the steeples of the unknown, then the dark hollows. The four major books have spread light not just on the living world, but fundamentally the human condition. They have not lost their freshness. More than any other work in history's scientific canon, they are both timeless and persistently inspirational. The four books, when read as a set chronologically, flow, and this is a major point I want to make tonight, flow like a well-wrought narrative, tracing the development of Darwin's thought across almost all of his adult life. The first, The Voyage of the Beagle, is one of literature's great travel books. It's richly stocked with observations of the kind that were to guide the young Darwin to his evolutionary worldview. And what I'm doing is suggesting here that if you have not read these books, very few people have, and I admit that before I published an anthology of the four several years ago, I had not read every word of every one, but that if you read them, to read them in the sequence that I'm presenting them now, in order to see Darwin's life as an intellectual epic from start to finish. After The Voyage comes what he called the one long argument for evolution by natural selection, arguably history's most intellectually important book, judged on a global scale. The Descent of Man then addresses the burning topic foretold in The Origin of Species, in which Darwin, in effect, drops the other shoe and ventures laconically that light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history. By the writing of The Descent, Darwin is confident that natural selection will prevail, and he delivers his conclusions forthrightly. He'd begun to get acceptance of the revolutionary idea by that time. And then finally, in the expression of the emotions, Darwin draws close to the heart of the matter that concerns us all, the origin and the nature of mind, the citadel, as he called it, which he could see, but he knew that science at the time could not conquer. Now, quickly to the Voyage of the Beagle. The ship was commissioned by the British government to conduct a coast and geodetic survey of much of the coast of South America. It took 5 years, from 1831 to 1836, and it ended up circumnavigating the globe. And now I ask you to imagine, for a 21-year-old man, and it could be a man or a woman in our modern era, in his case, newly escaped from Cambridge University and his training as a minister, to leave for 5 years, suffer no television, no radio, no newspapers, no contact of any kind except month-old letters delivered at infrequent ports of call. Now set before him was something far better, an unexplored world to navigate and record for history, with unimaginable discoveries awaiting at every turn for a young naturalist launched upon a great voyage with the vast majority of animals and plants of the world still unknown to science. All the specimens he could collect, valuable to science, and all the observations he made worth recording, and with no duties except gentleman companion to the Captain Fitzroy. That was apparently the real reason he was asked to come along, so Fitzroy wouldn't go crazy, but he went crazy anyway. As the ship's naturalist, the world was Charles Darwin's to possess. And that's the way a young person should see the world at least once in his or her life. For his contemporaries who had little information except from travel books and lectures, it was a rare, detailed look at the exotic four corners of the world. For us, and especially for those with any interest in natural history, it is a time machine, a vivid glimpse into the early 1830s, far from the familiar venues of Europe and North America. So now I'll show you a few scenes as recorded by artists with him or other contemporary artists. Rio de Janeiro at this time. Darwin is stuck here by the Portuguese customs official. He wants desperately to get to the fabled rainforest in the interior, the Atlantic forest, distinct from the Amazon, with high endemicity and enormous biodiversity. But they hold him up, and he's held up day after day after day until finally he writes in his diary, "I would kiss the dust from their feet if I could get through to visit the great rainforest." The quarter deck of the Beagle on which he lived for 5 years. The ship itself, Montevideo, the mole at the docking area of Montevideo, modern Uruguay. A Fuegian, the famous Fuegians at the Tierra del Fuego, living under terrible conditions at the end of the world, cold, hungry all the time. He was one of the first to study these hunter-gatherers living in an extreme environment before they soon became extinct. The remains of the cathedral in Concepcion, Chile, after one of the great earthquakes that occur there along the Ring of Fire in western South America. And the Galapagos Islands, the famous Galapagos. This is Albemarle and Charles as they looked in his time. It's remarkable that they have gained a certain an aura of great history. But the fact was that Darwin was only there 6 weeks. And during that time, you can almost read that he was homesick. He was going home. He wasn't paying that much attention. And it was up to Fitzroy to point out to him that the turtles differed from one island to the next. And I guess he said, well, yeah, that's interesting. And he was collecting finches, what were later called Darwin's finches, these little birds that differ from island to island have become a paradigm for the study of adaptive radiation and diversification. But he wasn't really thinking about evolution then. But he was collecting some things. He collected mockingbirds there. Probably the same, I know they're the same you have here, but just different races. He saw that there were different forms on the different islands. And it was there when, on the trip back, he was looking at the specimens and realized they differed. And he started thinking about independent creation on these islands and thought, well, maybe something's happening here. Maybe they're changing there. And so in a short period of time, he was already starting to think about evolution. I guess that's really the significance of the Galapagos in history for us. He wrote a friend later, I know it is like confessing murder, but I'm beginning to think that species are not immutable. Tahiti, passing through briefly. Now and then on back, where he settled down as a gentleman scholar and gentleman farmer, a member of a moneyed class, a member of the aristocracy, and he married into money. He married Emma Wedgwood, so that meant that he didn't have to do any work the rest of his life, and he didn't, of the ordinary sort. He spent the rest of his life at their home in Down outside London, and all his time on scholarship. Because by 1838, he had conceived the idea of evolution by natural selection and begun to ponder its implications and gather evidence for it. Evolution by natural selection is perhaps the only one true law unique to biological systems, as opposed to non-living physical systems. And in recent decades, it has taken on the solidity of a mathematical theorem. I'll say more about that shortly when I come to the future of biology. What is it? It states simply that a population of organisms contains multiple hereditary variations in some trait, say red eyes versus blue eyes in a bird population. And if one of these variants succeeds in contributing more offspring to the next generation than the other variants, the overall composition of the population changes and evolution has occurred. Further, if new genetic variants appear regularly in the population by mutation, they called them in those days sports, or by immigration, you can have the process of natural selection acting upon them, and the changes continue with them involved, and evolution then never ends. That was the point of it. Think of red-eyed and blue-eyed birds in a breeding population and let the red-eyed birds be better adapted to that particular environment. The population will in turn come to consist mostly or entirely of red-eyed birds. Now let green-eyed mutants appear that are even better adapted to the environment than the red-eyed form. As a consequence, the species eventually becomes green-eyed. Evolution has thus taken two small steps. It's as simple as that. The full importance of Darwin's theory can be better understood by realizing that modern biology is guided by two overwhelmingly powerful and creative ideas. The first idea is that all biological processes are ultimately obedient to, even though far from fully explained by, the laws of physics and chemistry. The second great principle of biology, of modern biology, is that all biological processes arose through the evolution of these physico-chemical systems through natural selection, as described in the aforementioned statement. The first principle is concerned with the how of biology, the mechanics of it, the units of it. The second is concerned with the ways the systems adapt to the environment over periods of time long enough for evolution to occur. In other words, the why of evolution. Knowledge addressing the first principle, the how principle, is called functional biology. That addressing the second principle, the why principle, is called broadly evolutionary biology. If a moving automobile were an organism, functional biology would explain how it's constructed and operates, while evolutionary biology would reconstruct its origin and history, how it came to be made, and its journey thus far. The impact of evolution by natural selection, nowadays grown very sophisticated and often referred to as the modern synthesis, or the modern synthesis and its follow-up, had been profound. To the extent it can be upheld, and the evidence to date has done so compellingly, we must conclude that life has diversified on Earth, and this is the point, autonomously, without any kind of external guidance. And there is the nub of the problem in dealing with it vis-a-vis our religions, our new intuitive belief. It's counterintuitive. Evolution in a pure Darwinian world has no goal or purpose. The exclusive driving force is random mutations sorted out by natural selection from one generation to the next. And now we come to this next slide, which is, of course, incomprehensible and almost invisible, put up there in order to hold your attention. Darwin realized that evolution has two dimensions. The first is descent with modification of the entire process, the process of natural selection. This dimension was what he had principally in mind by the expression, the origin of species, one form giving rise to another. But he also included, rather imperfectly, the multiplication of species by the splitting and divergence of populations, as he depicts here, during the course of the overall descent with modification. Darwin never came fully to grips with this second process, which is called speciation. In other words, the origin of biodiversity. But it was soon clarified by, and this is a bit of history few historians of science know, it was soon clarified by Alfred Russel Wallace who had come upon the idea of natural selection. That was well known, of course, independently of Darwin during the 1850s. In fact, they published a joint essay in the Proceedings of the Linnaean Society of London announcing the principle together, because Darwin had received Wallace's essay, and while he was in the middle of creating this enormous book he had planned, and he did the gentlemanly, the honest thing, which was at the encouragement of his associates. He published his version and the very similar Wallace version together. But Wallace went on, and we should pay a lot more attention in the future to him in the history of science. He went on, and in 1865, in a study of swallowtail butterflies of Asia, he laid out the principles of species formation in a quite modern form. By the beginning of the 20th century, others, including the British zoologist E.B. Poulsen, had worked out the details that were to stand the test of time. The triumph of the origin of species did not spring solely from its logic. It owed as much to the massive documentation that Darwin assembled for over 2 decades, piece by piece, upon that theoretical formulation. His masterwork is impressive enough for the quality of his evidence alone. Much of what he wrote contains valuable information for biological researchers and general readers who open this book today. 12 years after the origin of species, Darwin, in The Descent of Man, proceeded to make the case for human evolution openly. Victorian society, whose wrath Darwin had so feared, along with that of Emma, as to hold back the publication of The Origin until 1859, might not have been entirely scandalized by the descent of plants and animals, but they were unprepared to accept the descent of man from, as Darwin put it, some pre-existing form. And they were most certainly scandalized by the idea of apes as ancestors, as the evidence suggested from the very start. Yet Darwin had to take that step. It was implicit from the premise that evolution is universal. The indelible stamp of evolution, as he called it, is everywhere to be seen through human anatomy and evolution. But in 1871, Darwin and other evolutionists lacked the smoking gun. There was no fossil evidence. Over a century of research, however, has turned up and now an abundance of pre-human and early human remains, enough to establish the broad outline and many of the early details of the origin of our species. The family of man, as it turns out, and Darwin guessed, originated in Africa and spread out over the rest of the world in later ways. An editorial comment. This man was irritatingly accurate. He seldom made a mistake. I guess he was lucky. Well, he was also very careful, very careful. The line antecedent, we now know, to the human clade, the evolving line, split some 6 million years ago from the separate line leading to our closest living relatives, the chimpanzees and the gorillas. At the time, Darwin was piecing together the fragments of comparative anatomy that made his case for human evolution. He was also making yet another substantial advance, and that is evolution by sexual selection, a variant of natural selection. As he reported in the second and longer half of The Descent of Man, the book, it has a longer title, but the opening phrase is the one that's usually used. A great many of the most striking anatomical and behavioral gender differences of animals and human beings, he suggested, have risen by competition for mates, chiefly through seductive displays, but also primarily among the males through bluff and combat with the females looking on. As an entomologist, Darwin was able to start with dramatic examples in insects. Here are horned beetles, in which the males carry all the armament, and we now know they use that to batter one another like stags in rut. And the females on the right in this series are more plain-looking, responsible for building the nest and reproducing, and they live longer. Newts, salamanders of Europe, again, remarkable sexual differences. These are all from Darwin's Descent of Man. Horns, as in chameleons. The dewlap of the iguana genus Anolis, which you can see all through the West Indies and rest of the New World tropics, and in Florida too. Birds, of which there was in Darwin's time already a rich literature. These are hummingbirds. And in Europe, the common ruff. And then Linnae plus ultra, the birds of paradise. So spectacular that when the first specimens came into Europe, just the wings, they were cut off and sold. People thought they were the wings of angels that had been collected. The expression of the emotions in man and animals, the final Darwin tetralogy, is both an old-fashioned description treatise and the most modern of Darwin's major works. This is the fourth of his great books. On the one hand, it provides a straightforward catalog of human postures and facial expressions that might have been written in previous centuries, previous to Darwin. On the other hand, the book is rich and accurate enough in interpretation to have served as part of the foundation of modern psychology. Darwin was, in Conrad Lawrence's words, the patron saint of psychology. His pioneering contribution was this: he treated emotions and their manner of expression as products of evolution. The expressions of emotions are, in a nutshell, instincts, and as such they have evolved by natural selection in essentially the same manner as traits of anatomy and physiology. Darwin pointed to a continuity in the expression of emotions from animals to man. It was a telling argument to make. Here, for example, the very familiar signals that dogs give, actually wolves give to each other in matters of aggression and the settlement of dominance hierarchies. Hens, in their aggressive postures, settling disputes over dominance. And then Darwin, with his typical thoroughness, went into anatomical studies that were available at the time in order to catalog the facial muscles that were moved for expressing different emotions. He did this in minute detail. And he used volunteers and professional actors to show these expressions, as shown here, what turned out to be among the first photographs ever reproduced in books of any kind. I think he could afford to do that with the royalties he got from the origin. Now, I'm going to jump ahead in the time I have remaining, almost 150 years, and then I'm going to spin around 180 degrees and look to the future of biology, and not its countless applications, as you might have expected, but basic biology, the core of the science, the fountainhead of the future in its ideas. And what I'm going to claim, or the interpretation I'm going to give is open to dispute. So I can tell you this is very much my opinion, although it's widely shared by many others. It's probably not by all. But this is one view of what I'd like to call the century of biology. The science of biology is coming together. Enough of its disciplines have been linked by cause and effect explanations to suggest how some of the framework of a unified biology can be visualized. At its foundation, biological knowledge conforms to the two principles I just mentioned, arguably firm enough to be called, and I'll just say it, scientific laws. That is, they're all-inclusive and with no proven exceptions, and their consequences can be followed down and through wide and deep. The first law is that all the entities and processes defining life are ultimately obedient to the laws of physics and chemistry. And the second law, still in contention due to claim for counterexamples, is that all the diagnostic entities and processes of life and all of its diversity have evolved by natural selection. The conformity of life's processes to the physical sciences undergirds molecular and cell biology. Its universal application has been challenged by the arguments for supernatural intelligent design, and I cannot escape mentioning that. The champions of intelligent design may think that scientists are in a conspiracy against ID, but the opposite is true, for a point I like to make. Every researcher would love to discover an extrasomatic force. It would be one of the greatest achievements in the history of science. The problem, however, is that not a trace of evidence has ever been found, nor has there been a need, as has been argued incorrectly by the ID proponents. There's not been a need for some kind of a theoretical place marker that arise from gaps in the existing database. Much of the argument for intelligent design had consisted of pointing to very complex systems of living systems, and such as the eye, and then the rotating cilium of the E. coli bacterium, and saying that couldn't possibly have originated from evolution. It's just too complex. Well, we've explained the eye pretty well, and I'll tell you, that's a very poor argument to make, because it's an argument on negative evidence. And if it's tied, as it typically is, to the strengthening of religious belief by stating that religious belief or its consequences are consistent with science, that's very dangerous, because if you teach children that that is the case, and then those cases that remain of irreducible complexity, so-called, are solved. And believe me, they will be solved, because that's what we do. And we're very good at it. That's what science does, to solve those things. Then the damage will be considerable. The confidence of biological researchers, therefore, in the complete physicality of life remains, how shall I say it, adamantine. The same can be said for the exclusive role of natural selection in genetic evolution. The ruins of alternative theories, from neo-Lamarckism to punctuated equilibrium, litter the archives of past decades. The mysterious forces they imply, left unspecified and extraneous to the empirical evidence of genetics, runs counter to the remainder of the evidence used or accepted in evolutionary theory. Multi-level selection is a key for the full understanding of what is happening in the world. Selection working at different levels of biological organization. The levels of biological organization include the giant molecules of information and facilitation of enzymatic facilitation, to the organelles like nuclei, nuclear membranes, and mitochondria, and so on. The organelles, the next level is the cell, the next level to tissue, then on to multiple cell organisms, and then on up to populations, to societies, especially the superorganisms of the insect societies. And so what multi-level selection tends to is that is the interaction of selection occurring at these different levels, favoring one form of heritable trait at any given level of biological organization, such as the cell versus the organism. It favors or disfavors traits prescribed by the same allele, the same form of the same allele, at another level. A familiar example is the inherited disposition to certain kinds of cancer. An allele predisposing the unregulated growth of cells into a cancer is favored at the level of the cell that carries the allele. It's doing just fine, thank you. But it's disfavored by the cancer caused at the higher level of the organism. Organisms with cancer are host to multitudinous healthy offspring of the original cell, changed cell, but they lose in competition with healthy organisms that totally lack the mutant allele. Multi-level selection in this way typically puts selection at different adjacent levels in opposition. To achieve a new level, for example, a multicellular organism, full organism, or a complex society, requires some degree of altruism on the part of individuals at the lower level. And I have a reason for this slightly technical detail I'm giving. It's coming right up. It is promoted, the higher level is promoted by group selection, and it is opposed, as the cancer cell opposes it, by individual level selection. Such major transitions, that is going from one level, cell to organism to superorganism and so on, such major transitions across levels of organization have very rarely occurred in evolution, and they have taken long periods of geological time to have been achieved even once. I suggest that the rarity of the occurrence is itself a biological phenomenon of enormous significance. The origin of typical higher organisms, eukaryotic organisms, with a cell, a membrane around the nucleus, took over half the known history of life to be attained, just to be attained. From the beginning of life, over 3.5 billion years ago to 1.5 billion years ago. Multicellular animals were not added then for more than another 500 million years. The origin of insect superorganisms, the colonies, tightly knit colonies of ants, termites, and their equivalent, was not attained at all during the first great insect adaptive radiation that occurred toward the end of the Paleozoic. That was 350 to 250 million years ago. The world was swarming with insects of great variety, but none became insect colonies, social insects, the superorganisms. They didn't make it. Finally, it occurred only well into the late Jurassic or early Cretaceous periods in the age of reptiles, and that was 200 to 140 million years ago. Anyway, here's my main point. We are now in a new era of biology. It is in the major transitions just cited of evolution that biology, I believe, will predominantly dwell. The age of reduction in biology has largely passed. While enormous amounts of new information will continue to be yielded by the cleavage and analysis of systems, like taking apart a cell membrane, figuring out the exact structure of a mitochondrion and so on. The big problems in each discipline now are those that require a resynthesis of reduced systems. To be complete in a scientific explanation of living process, you have to be able to take it down to its basic elements and processes. You've got to break it apart. You have to understand how it works, item by item, pair of process by pair of process. But you're not done. It is complete only when you re-enter the stage of synthesis, meaning you put it all back together again, and either literally by creating life from these elements, or at least by models that exactly duplicate what's happening, you actually create the higher level, and you create life that way. As more biological systems come to be understood, and with them the major transitions, common principles of emergent evolution should become apparent. That is, you will see how properties at the higher level, that are only in the higher level, emerged from the combinations of interactions of the units at the lower level. The emergent properties that distinguish an organism from that distinguish it absolutely from the interactions of the lower cells. There appears to be no way to create such a unified theory of biology at the present time. That achievement awaits far more empirical information than we now possess, requiring immense amounts of hard work with real organisms. Contemporary biology has long been addressed and will continue to be addressed by two very different strategies of research. And they are worth making a distinction. The first strategy says that for every problem in biology, every problem that you discover that needs an explanation, there exists an organism ideally suited to solve that problem. So the bacterium E. coli has triumphed for molecular genetics. The little nematode worm, C. elegans, for the neuronal basis, the nerve basis, the exact definition of the circuits of nerve cells for behavior. The honeybee for the instinct and self-organization of animal societies. And I must pay a tribute to my distinguished colleague, Franz de Waal, the chimpanzee for the origin of mind and the function of elementary processes of the mind in sophisticated organization. If those faithful to this dictum are called the problem solver, the second tribe of biologists and researchers may be called the naturalist. The research strategy of the naturalist is the reverse of the strategy of the problem solver. It is that for every organism, select it. Take it because you love it. Birds, butterflies, not very likely, but fruitful, little nematode worms. You love it. You're deeply interested in it, you see. For every organism to which you direct your passion, there exists a problem for which the organism is ideally suited. In other words, you learn everything there is to be known about that organism. That's what the naturalist does, and group of organisms. And then, incidentally, you figure out what that group of organisms, it can be archaeopid, orb-weaving spiders, it can be little tiny tardigrades munching moss spores, you name it. Then you say, what can these species, which I know so well, and I'm studying at such depth because I love them, what can they teach us about biology? What problems can they solve? And so the two methods come together. The overarching goal of the scientific naturalist, too, is the complete mapping of biodiversity while acquiring knowledge of that biodiversity at each level of biological organization. The daunting nature of this task is made clear when an effort is made to estimate even roughly the number of species that exist on Earth. When the hyper-diverse microorganisms, bacteria and others, and the fungi and the small invertebrate animals are put on the roster, it turns out that we have discovered and named probably fewer than 10% of the species that live on Earth. The variety of genes prescribing all of these is astronomical, and of course, even less known. The third great goal, even more daunting, is the history of life. Because of the paucity of information on the living species and their genomes, in fact, we know nothing about the great majority. The phylogenies, the family histories of only a few of the best-known groups, such as birds and flowering plants, can be drawn with any confidence. And as to a record of all that has happened in past ages, the infant discipline of paleobiology, paleontology with a biology in it, faces a journey likely to take centuries, if not millennia. In fact, it will probably never be finished. Problem solvers at work, mostly in the laboratory, explain the proximate causes of biological phenomena, usually those visible only at microscopic levels. In other words, how the system works, to repeat. Naturalists working typically in the field, but also experimentally in the laboratory, stress the adaptation of biological phenomena to the environment, how they affect the environment, and the why in the attempted full explanation. The two approaches are equally valid, and I believe that it's very important to emphasize to students who are planning careers in biologists and others that both of them are necessary to achieve a full, balanced, and eventually unified biology. Although those two approaches, the how and the why, have seemed at times to represent independent cultures of biology, in fact, they are complementary and can, with more information, be fitted nicely together, and we will do that. At the risk of oversimplification, it can be said that naturalists discover the problems in nature that the problem solvers then set about to solve. Think of a unified biology as T-shaped. T-shaped. The horizontal arm is biodiversity at the level of the species and the genetic strains that make up each of the species. One vertical arm is the model species, I mentioned, of the problem solver, reaching across the levels of organizations from the populations that compose the species on down to the levels all the way to the genes that prescribe its diagnostic traits. At the present, perhaps fewer than 100 such model species exist and have been studied that way. In a decade or two, there will be thousands and then tens of thousands of such model species. The process will accelerate as DNA sequencing grows ever faster and cheaper. Existing knowledge will be immediately available, and its growth followed in real time, as the Encyclopedia of Life, just launched within the last year, gears up to provide complete information through a single portal of all species. The EOL, or Encyclopedia of Life, will, and already in operation, I recommend you check it out if you're interested. This web address is eol.org. Is set out to gather all information on every kind of organism on the world and have it together in a single portal on demand. There is running concurrently and launched at the same time the Biodiversity Heritage Library, which is setting out to scan everything ever written about every species, even collaterally, that's available all the way back through time, and to make that available on command to anybody, like the Encyclopedia of Life, to anybody, anytime, anywhere, free. And it's estimated the librarians who are doing this in major university libraries and elsewhere estimate that they will be doing 500 million pages to accomplish this. And if this sounds absurd, welcome to the age of globalization. They just passed the 8 million page mark. A unified biology, then, to draw to a conclusion, is a goal worth thinking about, even if it's still far from our grasp. Biologists are stretching causal explanations across wider segments of the levels of biological organization and in broader and broader arrays of species. In so doing, they are melding explanations of function and adaptation, as well as molecules and cells with organisms and species in explanation. As a result, the emphasis in research is shifting from one or two levels of biological organization, a narrow focus, to all the transitions between the levels. The major questions of biological theory are those of systems biology. They take the following form. How do the elements and processes that define one level emerge from the level below it? And why? And under what circumstance? Then, the next question, were the evolutionary routes followed the only ones? And if not, are they at least the optimal ones, or were they just purely accidental? A unified biology will be the one that maps the pathways from molecules to ecosystems in unbroken transits of causal explanation. It'll disclose the still unimagined commonalities, if such exist, among the evolutionary transitions. It will also provide insight into whatever different genetic codes and rules of transitions are possible, and which of these, while we're at it, might exist on the other worlds we hope to explore, to be discovered, we trust, in the further exploration of space. Thank you very much.